Good afternoon. Welcome to the Lapham Patterson House, located in Thomasville, Georgia. My name is Ann. I'm going to be showing you around today. This is a very unique house in a beautiful city. It was built in 1885 by Charles Lapham. We're going to talk a little bit about Mr. Lapham and the other owners of the house when we go inside. Currently, this house is owned by the state of Georgia, the Department of Natural Resources. It's one of the parks in the park system. And we are the Thomasville History Center, and we run this for the Parks Department under a concession agreement. So we're open a couple days a week, although we do open for groups on occasion if we rent the property for weddings and things like that. We're mostly open for guided tours, and the public loves to come through and take a look at this house. It's a classic Victorian house in some ways, but it has some other architectural features, Queen Anne style, stick style, and the house and its owners tell a really fascinating story. As we go throughout, we'll explain it to you. It was built in 1885 and came into the state's hands around the early 1970s when preservation was quite a robust thing in Thomasville and across the country. So we'd like to take you inside now and show you throughout the house, show you some of the rooms, talk about the families that lived here, and talk about the eccentricities of this house. Because as I said, it's classical Victorian in some ways, but it has a lot of unique, one-of-a-kind architectural features and stories that go along with it that make it a fascinating place to visit. Hi, so we're in the Lapham Patterson House, as I mentioned earlier, and this was built in 1885 by Charles Lapham. Mr. Lapham was a wealthy shoe merchant from Chicago, but before he was in Chicago, he was born in 1852 in Danby, Vermont. And he and his brother and his family moved to Chicago, unfortunately, in 1871 or around 1871, when, as I'm sure most of you know, the Great Chicago Fire broke out. Mr. Lapham and his brother and his family, they were unfortunately trapped in some of the burning buildings during the fire. And although they survived, he did suffer lung damage and emotional and mental damage, so to speak, for the rest of his life. He became pyrophobic, as almost anybody would if they were trapped in that situation. Mr. Lapham and his brother and his father, they ran a very successful shoe business in Chicago. Made a lot of money, and like a lot of wealthy Northerners, he came down to Thomasville to vacation to get away from those cold Chicago winters. So this was as far south as you could go on the railroad in the 1860s. Mr. Lapham starts coming down in the 1870s, 1880s, and he likes it so much that he decides to build his own house, or a cottage as he referred to it, so he could stay permanently, stay for longer periods of time, not have to stay in all your beautiful resort hotels in Thomasville. He didn't want to stay in those. He wanted to stay in his own house. So he built this 6,000 square foot cottage in 1885. We think it cost about $4,500 to build. And because of Mr. Lapham's fear of dying in a fire and his belief in naturalism, the house has a lot of eccentricities and unique architectural features to it. It is also just a lovely Victorian example of a house and was actually used as a marketing piece in the 1880s to convince people back in Chicago and Cleveland and places like that to come down to Thomasville and to spend their time here. So as we go throughout the house, you're going to see a lot of unique features, such as in this room, which, by the way, was Mr. Lapham's original bedroom. This is his original bedroom, one of his original bedroom sets that we have on loan to us. A lot of the furniture in the house, by the way, is of the East Lake tradition and is very classic from that time period. Some of it is on loan, some of it is permanently belongs to the state of Georgia. So in this room, you'll notice that the windows and the doors are at varying heights. They're not all the same width. They're not centered. And you also notice that this room is not in any way square. In fact, there are no square rooms in this house. All the rooms have multiple angles, multiple walls. This room alone has probably 12 or more walls to it. So some of that is due to I believe his naturalism, as I said, which is the belief that just as a tree in nature is not completely even or doesn't grow with even branches, the same number of leaves, let's say, neither was his house going to be that way. So, and there's also a lot of interesting features. As you'll see in this room, there's a door to the outside. Every room in this house had at least one door to the outside. Lots of windows, perhaps other doors, but at least one door to the outside. And of course, that was due to his fear of dying in a fire and left over from surviving the Chicago fire. So there's a lot of interesting architectural features, as I said, as we go throughout. Keep in mind this house is, I would say for the most part, if I had to pick a number, I would say at least 90 to 95% original, meaning the woodwork, the plaster work. It really has been kept in a very original state since it was built in 1885. And it has 19 rooms, it has 45 doors, 54 windows, and 13 fireplaces, just to give you a few stats and facts about the house. So I want to talk a little bit more about the Laphams. As I said, Mr. Lapham built this house and was the first owner of it. Really only lived here with his family for a short period of time. Unfortunately, he and his wife legally separated, as they called it, back in 1894. And she went her way with some of the kids, and Mr. Lapham went on to sort of enjoy retirement across the country. But the Laphams did have some interesting components to their family. As I mentioned, Charles was always afraid of dying in a fire, and ironically, his ex-wife, Emma, unfortunately did perish in a fire on her ranch out in Mesa, Arizona after they got divorced. But we're in the main salon right now, if you will. It has, again, some amazing features to it. The plaster medallion on the ceiling, the light fixture, the crown molding, which is all made of plaster as well. Those are all original, as is the woodwork and the floor. The Queen Anne window. There are 3 Queen Anne windows in the house, and this is the main one. So this was the room, as later generations and families owned the house, this is where people would pose for wedding pictures and christening pictures and things like that. And indeed, they held funerals and wakes and things in the houses as well, as they did back then. On the piano over here, we have some pictures of the Lapham family, Charles and Emma and their sons. And unfortunately, one of their children passed away while they were living here in the house. So there really isn't a long line of progeny left to the Lapham family. Charles and his sons, however, after they did pass away, are buried back in Chicago, where Charles was from originally. So in this room, we have a wonderful example of sort of the main salon, where sometimes they refer to it as the men's salon. The men would gather in one spot and the ladies would gather in another spot. And as I said, this is, again, not a square room. The wood patterns on the floor vary from time to time. There's different patterns throughout the floor, and they don't always necessarily match. But it is still a very formal and beautiful house, and was used for a lot of entertaining and things like that. So, and I think next we're going to go talk in the formal dining room and the ladies' salon, and I'll tell you a little bit about the next 2 families to own this house. So as I said, it's been around for over 130 years. We've only had 3 families own it, so I want to tell you about a little bit about the other families that owned it. Okay, so now we're in the formal dining room of the Lapham Patterson House, and I like to show this to people to point out that although Mr. Lapham had some eccentricities and obviously had some issues that he was dealing with in terms of being afraid of dying in a fire and all of that, he still built this beautiful grand house situated here on Dawson Street in Thomasville, which is one of the first historic districts to be laid out in the city. So this really had lots of nicknames, sometimes called the Painted Lady or Mr. Lapham's Whimsy, because as you saw from the outside pictures, it's this beautiful yellow and burgundy colored house sitting in this beautiful historic district. So Mr. Lapham was as much into entertaining as were the other 2 families that owned this house. The Larmans and the Patterson, by the way, are the ones that follow him. The Larmans are kind of only here for maybe 10 or so years, and then the Pattersons own the house for quite a time period. Both interesting families in their own right, but now I want to talk a little bit about the house and some of these features. So in this formal dining room, you can see we're kind of in a 6-sided room, but again, the wood pattern on the floor doesn't really quite come out even. If you take a look at the door behind me, or in front of me, I should say, the molding is cut off on the right side. So some of those features you would think, wow, if I'd paid somebody to build this house, I'd want my money back. Well, no, that was actually intentional. That was Mr. Lapham's desire to follow in his naturalism and his sort of spiritualistic ways. So again, this house is very functional. It works. It's still standing after 130 years, but architecturally it has some pretty unique features. Sometimes a lot of people come in and think that they notice these little nuances and these uneven things and these asymmetrical components, and it kind of drives them nuts. But actually, I always sort of explain it as it might have been the 19th century version of Mr. Lapham's feng shui. It obviously made him quite content, and he enjoyed it. But he did do have a formal dining room and obviously entertain guests, as many families would back then. Right now, we have the table set up lovely for our Christmas period. It's completely decorated for Christmas. Some local folks have helped us do that. And back then, there would have been quite a lot of tradition around the silverware, the plates, the decorations that would have been used. And when you had dinner parties and things, there would have been quite a lot of protocol into how people ate, who sat where, what silverware you used. And of course, all of these families were fairly well-to-do, so they had help. They had servants to help take care of things, and they got to enjoy the beauty of dining in a place like this. And the balcony above, which leads up to the second and third floor, is a floating cantilever balcony, which is actually suspended by 4 railroad rails. So again, the components of it are kind of unique to Mr. Lapham, but at the same time, it makes this beautiful formal entrance into the dining room. You can see straight out the front doors. You could have greeted your guests. This room is also circled by 3 sets of pocket doors. 2 are solid wooden, 1 has got glass. So again, Mr. Lapham was obviously understood the nuances of entertaining large groups of people and having formal parties, as did the Larmans and the Pattersons, I'm sure, as well. And then in this salon, we have the ladies' salon, or maybe the slightly smaller of the 2 salons. No offense to the ladies back then, but the men and lady did sometimes congregate separately. And it also has the porte-cochere off the outside. So before cars, or even when early cars came in, you would have pulled your horse and buggy, or eventually maybe your Model T. You would have pulled it into the porte-cochere, which is basically like an overhang to keep you dry. Come inside, enjoy some time with your friends, socialize, and perhaps go back down Dawson Street or go to the rest of Thomasville. Enjoy the rest of the recreational activities that took place in this town. This room is completely wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling Georgia pine. Of course, the irony of all of this as you go throughout the house is made of pine. Pine is very flammable. Mr. Lapham didn't want to perish in a fire. But I always tell people that obviously that was the wood that would have been available at the time, so it makes sense. This is a split flue chimney and fireplace. So it looks like one fireplace, but it's actually 2 separate chimneys. And that was also a unique design of Mr. Lapham's, so that if a fire were to break out, they could actually control the smoke and perhaps not be damaged by smoke from a fire. There's also a fire extinguisher on the back wall, which is a small metal tube just used to put out a quick, grease fire or something along those lines. Frankly, back then, fire departments worked very hard, but if a house like this made of this much pine, or a person's dress or something got caught on fire, it would have been almost impossible to put it out. But sometimes they were able to. So he did have some very modern features. He had a working running water on 2 floors. There's a sink in the corner there. And to have hot and cold running water on 2 floors, gas lighting throughout this whole house. This was a very modern house of the future, if you will, in 1885. And now we're going to go down in the kitchen wing and talk about how they maybe prepared food and took care of their guests.